From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LJ 119. My name is Ted Widmer. I'm the director of the John W. Kluge Center. And if you grew up as I did in New England, this time of year, April 19th, specifically the night of April 18th to 19th, is the night some of us remember as the outbreak of hostilities in 1775 and switch to a military phase of the long conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. It's now sort of devolved into just a marathon and a lot of parties around Boston, and not too many people remember the political circumstances of April 1775, but I can guarantee you one person in this room knows them very, very well. It's such a pleasure to introduce to you T.H. Breen, or Timothy Breen, who is the John Kluge Professor of American Law and Governance here at the Kluge Center. He's also the William Smith Mason Professor Emeritus at Northwestern University. He's the James Marsh Professor at Large of the University of Vermont. And that has to be the greatest job anyone could ever have, to be a professor at large. And that is what he's been for us. He's covered the waterfront. He's been an inspiring presence among us at our lunches and in the hallway, striking up conversations. The Kluge Center has a lot of different kinds of scholars and different disciplines, and Timothy's been just a wonderful addition to our mix. Many of you know his work already, and many of you are personal friends of his, and it's delightful to welcome you all here. I can't possibly list his productive output because it would take up most of the next hour. He's the author of more than 60 articles, many books, the most recent one of which is a favorite of mine, George Washington's Journey, which came out in 2014. In 2010, American Insurgents. In 2005, The Marketplace of Revolution, How Consumers Shaped American Independence. In 2003, Colonial Americans in an Atlantic World. 1985, Tobacco Culture. 1980, Puritans and Adventurers. 1970, The Character of a Good Ruler. And that's not even all of them, and I'm already out of breath. In all of this work, he's done political history, economic history, social history. He's written about the colonial North. He's written about the colonial South. He's written about everything. And it's just been a great personal pleasure for me as someone very interested in this period to spend these last few months with him. I'm looking forward not only to his talk today, but I'm really looking forward to his review of the new Museum of the American Revolution that opened in Philadelphia this week. He's covering it as a journalist, reviewing it for the New York Review of Books, and I think thinking about it as a journalist and as someone living in the present is part of the way Timothy Breen thinks about events that we are still dealing with on a daily basis. It's history, but it's still affecting us, and we have new institutions springing up with new interpretations. And thank God he's here to make sense out of it for the rest of us. So without further ado, please welcome Timothy H. Breen.
Thank you, Ted, and all of his staff and helpers who have made the last 4 months, if nothing else, extraordinarily productive. I mean, to work in the Library of Congress means I even imagine a book and it's on my desk the next day. It's an incredible resource. And so it's coming to the end, but my wife and I have really enjoyed being here, and I thank all of you on this hot day. I might say just in passing, the new Museum of the American Revolution that opened yesterday in Philadelphia is very good. I'm not going to trash it in my article. I thought I would. I went there with that goal, but progress and intelligence has betrayed me, and I came away feeling that this is an important contribution to our shared understanding of what the revolution means for a country. I come from 19th century Irish background, not part of the American Revolution, and yet the American Revolution is all of our, I mean, it created our political system for better or worse. I think better some days, but there you are. My comments today will be woven some way, I'm not quite clear, into a book that I'm writing. I was researching here, and it's called An Appeal to Heaven, which was the major slogan of the American revolutionaries, certainly in the first 1775 and 6. So it's an appeal to heaven, the American Revolution. And this book proposes to address several questions. My paper today won't address all of these, but I certainly will entertain questions. One of the oldest questions is still out there, and that is, what was revolutionary about the American Revolution? At the end of the day, that's still a problematic. Second, how did ordinary people, men and women living in small communities from Georgia to New Hampshire, experience the revolution, not as soldiers, but as members of small communities, sustaining and mobilizing and remobilizing a revolution that succeeded? In fact, the book that will argue that although most of our attention still is on the great leaders of the time, and maybe on the battlefield, sort of like NFL plays, you know, you follow the little marches and round. That's all important. I'm not denigrating that. But if it hadn't been for small towns that never saw the face of war that sustained the revolution, we would not have won. I mean, it was the people that got behind the cause and kept the cause alive. And third is a question that developed in the course of my research here, and that is, how did a war that generated such hate, such bitterness, a sense of revenge, anger at domestic enemies, your neighbors could have killed your family or destroyed your farm. There was hostility in the land, and yet at the end of the American Revolution, it ended. Unlike almost every other revolution we can think of, our revolution stopped. And there was not killing fields or massive sense of revenge in the land. I think that's something that needs to be explained, not in order to praise us as an exceptional revolution, but as a problematic in comparing our revolution with other revolutions throughout the war. Like a good undergraduate teacher, I have a crude handout that some of you have, I hope. I always praise the crudity of my handouts because I claim that it's more authentic. It's like more revolutionary. Rather, if it was neat, you see, it wouldn't be proper. So at the start, and I'll just read my comments as best I can and welcome your questions. Let me warn you in advance that this is a very radical presentation. If any of you want to leave now or are going to be offended, this is a triggering moment, right? You're going to hear some radical things. Rest assured, I'm not proposing anything wildly conspiratorial, such as that George Washington was really a secret agent for the British Parliament, or that the founding fathers wanted to redistribute landed property to the peasants in the name of worker equality. Rather, drawing on the research that I've been pursuing here at the center, thanks to Ted and his friends, I want to interrogate closely a revolutionary narrative that Americans, all of us, I think, have been telling ourselves about the nature of the nation's origins. The process of reconsidering the relationship between chronology and narrative, between the assumptions about time and its effect on causality, raises, for me at least, exciting, even radical new questions about the fundamental character of the American Revolution. Now, even to pose the question, as I have in the title of the lecture, what time was the American Revolution, may strike you as slightly perverse. since in fact the temporal boundaries of the revolution, from the initial colonial grievances to the achievement of political stability under the federal Constitution, have been well established in the historical memory of the United States for several centuries. But however persuasive this narrative may be, recent and ongoing research invites a thorough rethinking of the familiar account. Although some scholars once traced the origins of the American Revolution back to the dark forest of ancient Germany, they really did that, and others have insisted that the American Revolution did not realize its full revolutionary potential until the age of Jackson. The story of our national origins, think of third grade again in your life, most often begins with the 1760 coronation of George III, and then step by step it traces the growth of colonial unrest from resistance to the Stamp Act, through the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. After this defining moment in 1776, the standard litany of events loses some of its clarity, and many historians have leapt with interpretive grace from the Declaration of Independence all the way to the Constitution. I call this the lily pad or the frog pond theory of leaping from one event to another event. Of course, this traditional approach of time and narrative works best with intellectual history, or the story or the history of political thought, since the development of abstract concepts such as virtue and liberty often does not concern itself with the changing social and political context of the events on the ground. To be sure, a revolutionary narrative framed by the accession of George III and the ratification of the Constitution does possess a kind of compelling logic. It allows us to navigate a smooth interpretive path from national liberation to political stability. This traditional periodization, however, raises troublesome interpretive challenges. The standard narrative suggests, albeit implicitly, a kind of inevitability, a celebratory chronicle of the American people marching forward under the banner of liberty and rights to their well-deserved destiny as citizens of the new republic. Not surprising, this complacent story lends itself to organic, even providential metaphors. You know them. Children growing up and demanding that the mother country treat them with respect, or colonies growing to maturity like political plants until they flower in the form of political independence. From these perspectives, the temporal flow of crucial events acquires a kind of causal aspect, becoming in the telling a coherent teleological tale in which one thing leads necessarily to another thing, from beginning to end. The description of the nation's origins, therefore, often takes a kind of self-congratulatory tone, one grounded on the assumption of American exceptionalism, a belief that our revolution, this revolution, was somehow different, special, even unique, unlike other revolutions that have shaped the modern world. In this rendering, there is not much incentive to engage in a comparative analysis, in other words, to examine whether the American revolutionary experience over time paralleled, in interesting ways, that of other nations throughout the world. The French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Russian Revolution. What is at stake in posing a question about revolutionary time, therefore, is the possibility, the invitation, the excitement of developing a different, less teleological, more coherent understanding of the relationship between interpretation, periodization, and narrative. the alternative conceptualization of revolutionary time that I want to advance here is that what we now think of generally as a single, essentially monolithic block of time, a block of time roughly from 1760 to 1788, should in fact be three discrete segments, each demanding its own interpretive standing in the flow of time. I bring to bear evidence number one. You can look, you can follow. You see the block of time, and now three. It'll be on the final exam, so you pay attention. This revised perspective does not start with the assumption that history is moving towards a predestined goal, such as greater democracy or more personal freedom or a powerful American empire. Rather, my argument begins with the assertion that the period most often associated with the run-up to the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, in other words, the period 1760 to 1773, was nothing of the sort. These years are more accurately defined as a general crisis of imperial rule throughout the Atlantic world. The relatively minor provincial risings in the American colony, the Stamp Act crisis, the Boston Massacre, the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, let's face it, were really minor tremors in an ongoing effort by an ambitious imperial power to make sense of the unprecedented challenge of governing peoples of different races and of different backgrounds and of different places over a vast world in which communication remains slow and unreliable. The second new stage of this revised version of revolutionary time begins in 1774 with the military occupation of Boston and ends with a peace treaty of 1783, a period during which a colonial rebellion transformed itself into a genuine political and social revolution. It involved the experience of armed resistance, of large numbers of ordinary people suddenly assuming meaningful authority for the first time in communities throughout America, and of social relations that were no longer defined by monarchy or aristocratic relationships. These developments promoted a strong sense of Republican equality among white males that turned itself into an initial armed response against monarchical authority and eventually into a revolution that few people wanted or anticipated in 1776. The third period, again, look at your chart in this revised narrative, the years following the end of the war did not lead inevitably to the Constitution, the federal Constitution. Divorced from the traditional triumphal discourse that we all know, we should see the period after 1770, 1783 as a post-revolutionary moment in which ordinary people came to terms with life under an experimental federal regime, and as they did so, they sought to reabsorb into an uncertain civil society a large number of Americans who had recently sided with Great Britain. To depict this decade of the 1780s as the critical period, that's what it's called in most books, it focuses unwarranted attention on elite fears of disorder and anarchy, and by so doing turns an explosion of entrepreneurial energy among ordinary men and women into an alarming account of a revolution betrayed at the moment of its greatest success. So let me explain a little bit the rationale for this new narrative. And Ted, do you have a whip or something to prod if I go over? A radical recasting of revolutionary chronology begins with a thorough reassessment of the period before 1775. These years seem especially vulnerable to a teleological interpretation. One can easily understand the temptation to anticipate in these years the coming of revolution and independence, because we know what's coming, and it appears only fair from this perspective to depict every event as a harbinger to the final break with Great Britain. But even armed with the clarity of hindsight, there's no reason to conclude that local complaints about imperial rule, even urban riots, even threats of organized resistance, amounted to any more than what they were: highly limited protests that lost the potential for a large-scale mobilization within days or months of their initial occurrence. Such episodes hardly represented a serious break with imperial authority. Throughout the 18th century, the British showed remarkable ability to maintain order in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Negotiations in this empire usually involved a pragmatic mixture of carrots and sticks, and at the end of the day, even when lethal violence was employed, the narrative process successfully rechanneled local anger. For example, the bloody conclusion of the massacre of St. George's Fields in London in May 10th, 1768, there were at least 7 people that were shot down by government troops, about the same number as the Boston Massacre. But this was not a sign that the British people were conspiring to launch a revolution. Conditions in North American colonies were not that different. The Boston Massacre certainly did not lead inevitably to Bunker Hill or the Declaration of Independence. Instead, the event introduced 3 years of extraordinary peace. 1770 to 1773 were the most peaceful, consumer-oriented years of the whole colonial period. And poor Sam Adams was in utter despair at his ability to persuade the people that they had legitimate grievances against the empire. No doubt, Parliament's attempts during the 1760s to raise revenue, stamps, sugar, tea, irritated the Americans, especially those that lived in the port cities. But the fact of the matter is that the Boston agitators, even at the height of the Stamp Act crisis, did not receive much support from the ordinary people living in other parts of the British American colonies. Leaders of the colonial assemblies wrote to other leaders of colonial assemblies. They talked about possible coercion, about making stamp collectors resign, but that was about it. Even in Massachusetts, town meetings in the countryside showed little enthusiasm for an agenda of the Boston radicals. And I can say I have gone through all the town records that are still in print of these towns in Massachusetts, and outside of Boston, there was a big yawn about what those wackos in Boston were up to in 1765. So the ability to limit and control occasional controversy is precisely what one would have expected at the time, even if there had been no revolution. After all, the American colonists viewed the victory over the French in the 7 Years' War as incontrovertible evidence of their American loyalty to the empire. And by their own lights, they were now full partners in a powerful, expanding imperial regime. Insomuch as the Americans experienced a growing sense of nationalism after the war, they expressed it in almost a reflexive, emotional attachment to Great Britain. Indeed, many historians call this phenomena, and I think rightly, the sense of colonial nationalism. What then, you might say, should there be any critics out there, of the much quoted pamphlets that drive the standard account of the coming of the revolution? Surely, like the prophets of the Old Testament, they were preparing the way. But in fact, celebrated writers such as John Adams and John Dickinson were not heralds of an independent republic. These colonists who analyzed the American grievances were members of a Creole elite, in other words, a group of wealthy, privileged, well-educated men who felt themselves marginalized within the imperial structure. That was their problem. No, not enough patronage is going our way. What these ambitious Americans wanted was, let's put it bluntly, respect, to be accepted by the leading British political figures as fully British and not as lesser beings who inhabited the marshlands of empire. George Washington sulked when he was not given a proper commission in the British Army. John Adams, looking to make a political or legal career in Massachusetts, complained bitterly that Hutchison's clan got all the business and he had not received any imperial patronage. Protesting his imagined inferiority in British eyes, Adams announced, "I say, we are as handsome as English folks here, and therefore should be free." James Otis agreed. Benjamin Franklin held out in the hope of acceptance to the very eve of revolution. It was only when he was humiliated during a public hearing in London that he finally decided that Philadelphia was his home. The Creole leaders were not plotting revolution. They only wanted to be accepted in the Imperial Club. Francis Bernard, a royal governor of Massachusetts during the 1760s, a very smart and misunderstood man, understood how to accommodate these uppity colonials. And he advised the Earl of Hillsborough in 1769 that if Parliament would only create a kind of upper house in each colony, a kind of American House of Lords filled with wealthy Americans appointed by the king, it would, and I quote Bernard, go a long way to remedy the disorders to which the government of America is subject to. And he predicted, I think correctly, that eager Americans would fall all over themselves to have, and I quote again, Baron prefixed to their name. The beauty of the change would be that in the addition of so many royal honors from the new form of government, it will assist in the establishment of it by engaging men who are ripe for honors to reconciling the people to the system that introduces the new honors. Nothing came of the plan, since in fact parliamentary leaders did look at the Americans, as well as the Irish, as well as the Scots, as inferior subjects. That's true. But bias here threatened what could have been a brilliant reform to save the empire. What once appeared as simply the inevitable run-up to the American Revolution, therefore, takes on a very different character when we view it as a crisis within the empire. Great Britain was not alone in having troubles with demanding Creole leaders. Throughout the New World, they demanded more authority. They demanded a meaningful voice in the Atlantic economy. This was the moment when the British, the French, and the Spanish discovered for the first time that they were not fully in control of the lands and the peoples of the New World that they claimed to rule. The New World remained uncharted territory for these imperial administrators. An awareness of this demanding, fluid, experimental aspect of 18th century expansion, I think erodes our standard revolutionary narrative. And indeed, it brings us into an unprecedented imperial crisis and reminds us that the pre-revolutionary period was not pre-revolutionary at all. It was rather a period of sorting out complex relations, races, distances, peoples throughout a territory that amounted to half the globe. The second, even more significant break in the standard revolutionary time occurred in 1774. This was a crucial year. This was the major year that witnessed the rendering of time, rendering of the old narrative we all learned in third grade. For although memories of an earlier period shaped the political consensus of consciousness of Americans, the landscape of power underwent a sudden and profound shift. And the trigger for massive change was not the traditional story of the coming of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. It was not the Boston Tea Party. Many Americans saw the destruction of the private property in Boston as an extreme and unpleasant form of protest, as an unwarranted provocation, an attack on property. And there was, in fact, almost no outpouring of popular support for the people of Boston who organized throwing the tea into the water. What fundamentally and irrevocably transformed the character of colonial politics was not the destruction of the tea, but the reaction in Parliament to the destruction of the tea. The story of protest by Creole leaders suddenly became a tale of massive popular mobilization. And so in 1774, we enter an entirely new, unprecedented political world. Lord North and his allies passed a series of harsh retaliatory acts known as the Coercive Acts, which not only closed the port of Boston to all commerce, but more important, and I think we overlook, authorized armed military occupation of the second largest city in colonial America. I might say that the Brits had never used armed occupation in their own cities under any way. This was a provocation of great, great magnitude. And for the colonists living in distant places such as South Carolina and Virginia, the British punishment seemed totally out of proportion with the seriousness of the crime. Overnight, Boston became a city occupied by a standing army and its subjects subject to martial law. And suddenly, in that year, you find Americans, ordinary Americans, men and women, talking about something called the American cause, a new phrase in the lexicon of protest. The revisionary view of revolutionary time that I'm proposing takes our attention away from the writings of celebrated leaders, the pamphlets, the arguments of lawyers and planters. My time restores the people who actually showed up at Bunker Hill and figured out what revolution meant in their lives without having to read the learned pamphlets that have figured so centrally in our intellectual history. One detail, and I know there's an Irishman way back there. One detail I just want to give you that, shall we say, puts us on the alert about the standard teleological account. My research and the research of other scholars have shown there was a massive flood of Irish immigrants, massive, in 1774 and 75 into the American colonies. They were driven out of Ireland, mostly in the north, by British restrictions on the linen industry that were very similar to the restrictions on American stamps and so on. My point was these Irish men came to America and had no experience or memory of the American protests of the 1760s. They were irritated. They knew to hate Brits on their own. They didn't need the American experience. So what does it matter? The research has found that in some of the continental lines, in Pennsylvania especially, over 60% of all the fighting men were new Irish immigrants. So much for the teleological argument about growing protests. These are new men angry at the empire. Now, 1775, these protests or this resistance did not signal the start of a genuine revolution. That came later. At first, most Americans hoped that Lord North and his supporters would simply come to their senses and find a way to negotiate, a way to save the empire. They wanted reform, not independence. And there was little, almost no enthusiasm for Republican government. From this perspective, almost all Americans in 1776, 75 I'll say, were loyalists, all of them. They simply wanted the British to back down and restore an imperial system that would bring them security and respect within the empire. Thomas Jefferson noted in something that you all should read because it's kind of a weird document, and that is the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. It's a testimony to good teaching. I mean, we all think it's so well written, but it took his colleagues to cut the adverbs and the adjectives out and make it pretty. What did he write at this moment of the second period of time? We might have been a free and great people together, but a communication of grandeur and of freedom, it seems, is below the British dignity. Be it so, since they will have it so. The road to glory and happiness is open to us. We will climb it as a separate state and acquiesce in the necessity which pronounces us to say to Britain an everlasting adieu. That got cut out. At the start of the war, therefore, the American insurgents clashed over strategies of reconciliation and not over fundamental political ideas. Even colonial leaders who later opposed independence championed at the beginning of resistance values such as virtue and liberty. By 1776, however, a protest against the British oppression had begun as a colonial rebellion comparative to India or Nigeria or other former colonial states. It had become a real revolution. The transformation did not involve a shift in fundamental political principles. Ideology did not turn rebellion into revolution. After all, the idea that the people are the only legitimate source of political power has a very long history reaching back into the Middle Ages. The new element in the time equation was experience, quite simply living through a time of violent political change. It's one thing to discuss with your friends in the pub rights and equality in the abstract, but quite another to experience newly formed groups, army groups, committees of safety and inspection that recruited people that had never served in any political movement at all. Participation in political resistance created fresh and new and exciting emotional bonds that carried radical potential. White American males came to believe, in a crude sense, their equality. Aristocratic claims to special privilege no longer counted for much. Achievement through work suddenly transcended the old order. That's revolutionary in the late 18th century. To be sure, the language of rights inspired American revolutionaries. The traditional story of revolution stresses the centrality of these ennobling principles. They did yesterday in Philadelphia. But that approach discounts other binding elements, some of which make modern commentators on our revolution uncomfortable. The actual experience of war included not only Republican ideas, but also a forgotten lexicon of unsettled words, such as fear, vengeance, retaliation, denunciation, betrayal, revenge, and violence. That's part of our revolution, too. It is this emotionally charged political environment that has gone missing from the historical literature. Securing our revolution was difficult and dangerous. For all people, suspicion of neighbors, enforcing the revolutionary agenda, taking property from domestic enemies is often thought as a part of the story of other revolutions, less nice, less good revolutions than ours. But I can assure you, it was a nasty business, those 8 years. After the victory of Yorktown, Americans entered the third and final, and blessedly for you, short period, which is best described, I think, as our post-revolutionary period. This different terminology, post-revolutionary, deflects our attention away from the absolute obsession with the coming and the drafting of the Constitution. George Washington, Andrew Hamilton, James Madison, the dominant characters in the campaign to establish a strong central government, certainly they did worry about the dangers of political fragmentation. They became so anxious about the threat of stability that, in fact, that they greatly exaggerated the danger posed by small agrarian riots such as Daniel Shays, a group of impoverished veterans in Massachusetts that presented absolutely no military threat to anybody, but it became a national incident of great historical power in our story of ourselves. But however we may admire Washington, we do not have to accept this analysis. If one concentrates chiefly on elite fears, on looming anarchy, as most American historians have done, one discounts the buoyant optimism that characterized the American people as a whole. There's not much evidence that they were paralyzed by anxiety over the country's future. The revolution in itself unleashed an extraordinary burst of energy and optimism. Suddenly, after years of British economic regulation, ordinary Americans devised schemes everywhere to better their lives, build a canal, speculate on land, a new mill, people were participating in fresh and exciting and free ways in a growing economy. And they moved west in huge numbers, probably the worst thing that ever happened to the Native American peoples on this continent. But they did, like locusts, they moved west and started new lives and took up new farms. And they had lots and lots of children. The greatest percentage of population growth in the history of the United States occurred in the 1780s, and it is almost not traceable to migration from foreign countries. Men and women are having kids because they're optimistic about the future of their country. They are not sitting around saying, oh, we need a strong federal government. Where should we go to Philadelphia? Huh? The rejection of the standard narrative, a smooth, almost predestined tale of gifted leaders guiding the people from colonial protests to political stability, therefore brings into fresh focus and new challenging concerns. And to me, the payoff seems obvious. First, the years before 1774 become part of a genuinely comparative world story about imperial rivalries throughout the Atlantic world. The competition for military and commercial dominance shaped the lives of ordinary Europeans and African slaves, as well as indigenous peoples. Second, an account of the actual experience of living through a revolution restores ordinary people to a tale previously dominated by a group of leaders. It liberates us from the obsession on the Founding Fathers and gives genuine agency to the people in the creation of their own new republic. And third, by rejecting the teleological account of the Constitution as almost providential, restores our appreciation of a surge of popular entrepreneurial energy that generated excitement in a post-revolutionary society. The new periodization of revolution here, I posit, is dynamic. It's open to the people who did not pen founding documents or serve as generals or as statesmen. And so, in a search for a more textured, more complex, more inclusive, more comparative revolution, it is time that we all ask ourselves, what time was the American Revolution?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I've learned a great deal from it. I've asked a number of people, as a sort of test, what gave rise to the Boston Tea Party? And almost invariably they say, well, the British increased the taxes. But I gather, in fact, it was almost the opposite, that people like Sam Adams were smuggling tea from Holland, undercutting the British, and the British dropped the export tax to be more competitive. Now, it may be more complicated than that, but I'd love to know what your views are.
No, you're absolutely right, even though I was fearful that your accent would lead to an attack. In point of fact, the Tea Act would have lowered the price for the consumer. What the Americans said is, lower price or not, it's still a tax that we didn't vote on. And so it's, on principle, not acceptable. But again, my point was, all that aside, it was the British reaction, sending General Gage and thousands of soldiers to Boston and closing Massachusetts to all commerce and closing all town meetings that by then had a 200-year history of self-government. It's exactly the same thing. I'm looking at my Irish friend back there. It's exactly the same thing the Brits did after the Easter Rising. The Easter Rising, most Irish people thought were a bunch of nutters, you know, and they probably were. But it was the execution day after day after day and the humiliation of the Irish people that turned a weak protest into a rebellion. Same thing happened here. Nutcases were made martyrs to the people. Yes, he's going to give you a speaker dinger.
At the beginning of your lecture, you raised the intriguing question of how Americans coped with reabsorbing those who had been the enemies within in the wake of the revolution.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could say a little about that and your conclusions on that.
Okay, thank you very much for, because that's what I spent the last 4 months studying here at the library, and now Ted will think he got his money's worth. It is cited probably impressionistically that about 60,000 Americans left at the end of the war and went to Nova Scotia or other places, sometimes to the Caribbean. And of that group, a huge number were not eager to go because they were the slaves owned by these people, so whatever the number is. But The research that I've done shows that the great majority of people that had participated as enemies of the revolution in some demonstrable way, either giving aid and comfort to the enemy or perhaps even serving in one of their loyalist legions, far exceeded that 60,000 number. And this set off a very forgotten, thankfully it's forgotten because now I can write my book, but the first great refugee crisis in America. Because these people that had been enemies of the revolution, and some of them have done some very bad things, they wanted to come home. They wanted to live with their neighbors they had violated and humiliated and hurt. And the ordinary people of America said, no way, no way. It was the leaders and the people that signed the peace treaty in Paris that said, as all political documents like this, the language is very wishy-washy, but that Congress of the United States would recommend to the separate state governments that they would not pursue loyalists or any other people who had acted against the interests of the United States before the peace treaty. The people were not happy to hear this, and there were many, many incidents of local violence. The Sons of Liberty, which we associate with the lead up to the revolution, reformed in Boston in 1783 to keep the refugees out. But in time, by 1786, remarkably, I think people, they wanted farms, they wanted to go west, they wanted to say hello to all these kids they're having. Whatever they did, the hatred dissipated. And so it's true that, for instance, some of the leaders in the Washington cabinet were Tories. They had, come back. Trench Cox is one economic analysis. The point is that for men, a concatenation of elements in our country, and I think probably it was its size, because what happened to the Tories, my answer is usually, and it's very glib, is Ohio. People found other things to do than pursue revenge. If I may, I don't see questions, I'll maybe end with a story I found in my research here. Some of the hottest, most physical, violent, horrible crimes of neighbor against neighbor took place in the American South, Georgia, South Carolina, especially upcountry South Carolina. And there's a town there that some of you may have gone to called 96. People think I'm making it up, but it is a town, and it's 96 miles from Charleston on the old Indian Trade Road. 96 had some bad times during the war. And there was a man that had created real havoc, who had the interesting name of Matthew Love. That was the last thing I'd associate with Matthew, because he was a killer. But the war ended and the peace treaty was announced, and he showed back up in 96. He said, I'm here, guys. I'm back home. The locals said, oh, boy. They locked him up in jail, and they waited for the judge to come up, because there was a Judges Road Circuit in South Carolina, came up, and there was Judge Grimke. You may recognize the name because he had two interesting daughters that protested slavery on the coming of the Civil War. Judge Grimke read to the jury a statement. He said, look, we hate this guy. This guy did some really bad things, but they were war crimes, and this court and this people are not authorized to deal with war crimes. That's another world. We're a new world. We're new South Carolina. We have our own laws, and there's nothing we can do with Matthew Love. And he wrote in his little diary, he said, the people listened. They were so attentive. It was like a civics lesson, you see. They said, oh, yeah, right, with war crimes and now times. And they all took the Judge Grimke back to the local hotel. Probably had a drink or two, and he went to bed. And the people of 96 marched back to the jail and executed Matthew Love. moment resolved the tension. That was, for these people, that was the end of the war. It wasn't a mass killing, but there were limits, and then they found it. Yes?
Well, thank you for a wonderfully revisionist account, but I was hoping you will answer your own question, namely, most revolutions have similar beginnings. But the American Revolution had, as you point out, a rather unique ending, a very successful ending.
Right.
And so this post-revolutionary optimism, how do we explain it, and why every other revolution ends in terror, in rather authoritarian regimes? And so what made it possible then?
Right.
This post-revolutionary success, even before the Constitution, before
Right.
Philadelphia.
I mean, if you do the standard account, it's like, I know you study, religious history and whatnot. It's like the standard New Testament account. What books are in or not, and we tell ourselves the story of these wonderful leaders who were worried about anarchy and led us to stability. That's the answer. We have a constitution. The fact that it's one of the most undemocratic documents you can possibly read is beside the point. I just think that there were elements, mostly the size. I've come to think that a much maligned historian of the late 19th century, the Turner thesis, he said that basically the frontier, that makes a lot of sense to me now, of people rushing to Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana and reinventing themselves and finding new ways to make money. They're not pretty people. This is capitalism without control. I understand all that. But they were following a different tangent of their lives. And because of the distances out there and whatnot, it made it very hard to have the post-revolutionary experience say that one of them was France, or Haiti never had a good day after there.
I have some piece of the Hannah Arendt thesis also in your account. The very experience of agency, revolutionary agency, somehow was transformed into political activism later, while ending the revolutionary agency and was transformed into normal political democratic activity.
Yeah.
So this is the unique. I mean, this is Hannah Arendt thesis.
I know, and I said I didn't want to have an exceptionalist view. And I don't, but I've kind of fallen into it beside myself. I mean, I think almost anybody who witnessed American society in the 1790s and in the Jeffersonian period, Tocqueville was right. He was a good observer. I don't like him, but he was a good observer. But he said, these Americans, they have a problem. What do? They form a committee. They have a group. They don't turn to the government to solve their problems. But in a sense, they came out of the revolution. That was the genuine heritage of the revolution. A mind experiment that's very interesting, is that much of what is seen in the literature of the revolution today, and I won't name historians, they're all wonderful and good, and that is that America became more democratic, more open, more inclusive, and so whenever one thinks of the roly-poly world of Andrew Jackson, that's the American Revolution working itself out, right? But let's say the revolution hadn't occurred. How much of what we see as revolutionary America would have happened anyway? Is Canada a despotism that we had to avoid? No. I mean, England is giving the Irish the vote, for God's sake. I mean, these things are in the air. So a lot of the elements that we say are part of our revolutionary heritage would have happened anyway. All right, I'm finished. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.